Aviate, navigate, communicate.
It's Friday the 20th of April. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. Today we're going to discuss some of the issues that the crew of Southwest Flight 1380 faced during their recent emergency. We'll go through the engine failure checklist, the emergency descent checklist, and the emergency landing checklist. I'm currently a first officer on the Boeing 777, been flying for the major airlines for about 18 years now, and over those 18 years have had the opportunity to fly a variety of aircraft, including the Boeing 737, the Airbus A320, the 757, the 767, and even the 727. Before I got on with the airlines, I was with the Air Force first as a T-37 instructor pilot, then C-141 aircraft commander out of Travis Air Force Base, and then a short stint of duty in the C-130 with the Reno Air National Guard. Nevada Air National Guard based out of Reno Cannon Airport. But first, let's check in with young Lieutenant Pete Brown on the three facets of aviation that the young aviator learns from the very first moment he steps foot on the airport, and why it's so important to prioritize these steps. And here to discuss the three principles of flight in sequential order is once again young Lieutenant Pete Brown.
Aviate, navigate, communicate.
Aviate, navigate, communicate. That helps the crew prioritize their actions in dealing with this emergency. You notice communicate was of the last priority, and this should go a long way to help explaining the question why passengers ask, how come we didn't hear anything from the captain during this entire emergency? This entire emergency only lasted a mere 20 minutes from the time that engine failed to the time that the aircraft was safely landed on the ground at Philadelphia. Aviate, fly the aircraft, the first order of business. On a typical airline flight, flight crews swap back and forth pilot flying duties. For example, on the first leg, maybe the captain's leg, the captain will fly the aircraft from takeoff to landing, and then on the next leg they'll swap out and the first officer will get to fly the aircraft from takeoff to landing. So in normal operations, the pilot flying is flying the aircraft, the pilot monitoring is running the radios and checklists. In the event of an emergency, it's more critical than ever to determine who has the aircraft. We have some new information from the NTSB now that when the engine failed on Southwest Flight 1380, at about 32,000 feet, when that number 13 fan blade failed and went through the engine, technically a contained engine failure, the resulting vibration shook the engine so hard that the inlet section to the engine failed. When that inlet section failed and blew apart, it created so much drag that that's what banked the aircraft up to 42 degrees. It was the debris from that inlet that also hit the window that caused the rapid depressurization. So now, who has the aircraft? Well, climbing through 32,000 feet, typically the aircraft is on autopilot. When the aircraft is upset to that degree, 42 degrees of bank, the autopilot's most likely going to kick off, and so the pilot flying has to recover the aircraft, and it will just instinctively right the wings. Now, at this time, we don't have all the flight data recorder and cockpit audio conversation released to the public yet. The NTSB is reviewing all that data right now. So very soon we'll get a very clear picture of exactly what happened inside the cockpit of Flight 1380. At this point, the crew notices an engine fire indication on number 1 engine, which makes sense because as that fan blade proceeds through the rest of the engine, the compressor section and the turbine section, as you saw in the previous video, that resulting vibration and destruction of the engine scraping through the Kevlar. Remember, it's a Kevlar composite based structure that contains this engine from blowing apart, unlike the inlet structure. The temperatures increase to the point to where you get an engine fire indication. So that leads the crew to the engine fire checklist. When it comes to engine failure checklists, you have typically several to choose from: a simple engine failure, an engine fire, or a severe engine damage separation checklist. Separation, yes, these aircraft engines are designed with a three-point mount on the wing. If in the event that that engine were to suddenly seize or suffer such extreme vibration that it's going to potentially harm the rest of the airframe, these engine mounts are designed to separate, and that entire engine can separate from the airframe before it damages the rest of the airframe. But of course, in this case, the engine stayed on. The inlet structure is what blew apart. Regardless of which checklist you choose, it leads you down to shutting down the engine. In the case of engine severe damage separation, that's a memory item. Through memorized procedures, they get that engine shut down. But this is a very carefully choreographed procedure to avoid shutting down the wrong engine. And this is where CRM, or Crew Resource Management training, really kicks in. Have you ever gone into surgery to have your knee worked on before after in my case, a dirt bike incident? The medical community has really learned a lot from aviation and has adopted a lot of our crew resource management techniques. When you go in now to the doctor to get a particular part of your body worked on, they mark that part of the body with a Sharpie pen and get you, the patient, to sign that everybody agrees that this is that part of the body that they're going to work on. And this is how engine failure checklists are run just as well. Now, in the initial stage of an emergency, the pilot flying continues to fly the aircraft and the pilot monitoring runs the checklist. So for an emergency failure checklist by memory, the pilot monitoring will start off by turning off the affected auto throttle switch. He will then direct the pilot flying to retard the affected throttle to idle. That way you can verify that you both are working on the correct engine, as the pilot flying will quickly be able to tell whether you've got the wrong throttle or not. Then the pilot monitoring, with concurrence with the pilot flying, will carefully shut off the correct fuel cutoff switch. And then the pilot monitoring, along with the pilot flying's concurrence, will pull the correct engine fire handle. That shuts all fuel, electric, hydraulics, and everything off to the engine. Since this was a fire indication, the pilot monitoring will also rotate that fire handle, discharging 1 of 2 bottles of fire extinguishing agent into that engine. At this point, the pilot monitoring will get into the QRC, or quick reaction checklist, and do some of the cleanup items associated with this checklist, including getting the APU auxiliary power unit online to restore some of the redundancies to all of our aircraft systems. Other folks have asked, what about if you lose an engine on takeoff? Well, that's a whole nother video series we can talk about. But basically, these aircraft are designed that at gross weight on takeoff, if you lose an engine past your takeoff decision point, you have enough power to climb out, clean up, fly around the pattern, and land. However, at low airspeeds like that, that is where you will experience your greatest amount of adverse yaw, and it does take very quick pilot reactions to keep the airplane straight, stepping on the good engine, to keep the aircraft straight and climb out safely away from the ground. And that's a maneuver that we constantly simulate and practice in the simulators every 9 months that we go back for simulator training, called a V1 cut. But the crew of Southwest 1380 faced much more than just a simple textbook emergency procedure practiced in a simulator. At the same time that they're dealing with this emergency failure, they get the cabin altitude warning horn indicating that the cabin altitude is exceeding 14,000 feet, indicating they need to initiate an emergency descent. And the first step of the emergency descent, again, memory items, is to get your oxygen mask on. Oxygen mask on, communications establish. I I can't begin to tell you how frustrating it is to get communication established once you got this giant oxygen mask on. Here, I'll show you a picture of what a pilot oxygen mask looks like. Remember, the pilot's oxygen system is separate from the passenger oxygen system. It's a oxygen tank about 1200 psi located in the aircraft and fed to two of these Darth Vader masks that can give you 100% oxygen for a pretty long time. These oxygen masks often have goggles to help you in the event that there's smoke in the cockpit, to help you see the instrument panel. These pilot oxygen masks do have microphones in them. You got to do a little switchology to get them to work correctly so that you can establish your communications with each other using the cockpit speakers, and also with ATC radio, using the radios, and as well as anybody in the back of the aircraft. So as you listen to the ATC audio tapes of Southwest 1380, you can hear the use of the oxygen mask. It gives you a very Darth Vader sounding voice as you try to communicate through this oxygen mask. Every time you inhale, you hear a big Darth Vader inhale noise as that 100% oxygen gets blown down into your lungs. The passenger oxygen system is completely different than the pilot oxygen system. Passenger oxygen masks will deploy automatically when the cabin altitude exceeds a certain amount, usually around 14,000 feet cabin altitude. The oxygen masks can also be manually deployed from the cockpit by pushing the passenger oxygen switch. The passengers have chemical generators located overhead your head there, and that's why the first step is jerk to inflate your mask and then put it on both your nose and mouth. Regarding the picture of the folks improperly wearing the masks, we don't know at this point at what point this picture was taken. Perhaps that picture was taken when they were already down to 10,000 feet and the oxygen generators were running out of oxygen. We don't know yet. So those oxygen generators will give you some oxygen flow, but anytime you're wearing that Dixie cup, you're mixing the oxygen from the generators with cabin air. It's not 100% oxygen all the time for the passengers. Those oxygen generators only last a certain amount of time, a matter of minutes. That's why the emergency descent needs to occur so quickly to get the aircraft from cruise altitude to a habitable altitude of about 10,000 feet. So we all know we can breathe just fine at 10,000 feet. Let's go back and talk a bit about pressurization and atmospherics. The Earth's atmosphere is about 300 miles thick. That means at sea level, there is a force of 14.7 pounds per square inch of atmospheric pressure acting upon you at sea level. The majority of the atmosphere is squeezed down to the lower portions of the atmosphere so that by the time you're at 10 miles or 52,000 feet, you're at a very tiny fraction of that 14.7 pounds per square inch. At 30,000 feet altitude, you're down to about 4 pounds per square inch. An aircraft fuselage is basically a balloon, an aluminum tube balloon that is constantly inflated and deflated every cycle, every landing and every takeoff. How is that balloon inflated? It's inflated using the air conditioners or air cycle machines, one off of each engine, one pack as they call them, provides an excess amount of air to keep that fuselage pressurized. That the amount of pressurization is controlled by an outflow valve located near the rear of the fuselage. The maximum pressure differential for the average aircraft fuselage is about 9 psi. So by pressurizing the aircraft, not only are we creating a habitable, comfortable environment for us to breathe in, but we're also maintaining the structural integrity of the fuselage. What happens when you bust a window out of the fuselage? A rapid depressurization. The aircraft fuselage seeks to achieve the equilibrium with the outside air pressure, the low outside air pressure, thus creating the depressurization. All that air is quickly and suddenly rushing out of that broken window. So it's a common misconception that some people have that they think it's the speed of the aircraft that creates this suction. No, it's simply the difference in cabin altitude versus atmospheric altitude of your present altitude. Another common misconception folks have about airliners is regarding doors and emergency exits while in flight. It is physically impossible to open up any door or emergency exit in flight. Why? Because the aircraft is pressurized. Doors and emergency exits are sealed doors. They are designed such that they press up against the fuselage while the aircraft is pressurized. As you step onto the airplane, take a look at the way the door has a complex hinging action that it's got to come open and clear the sealed entry in order just to get the door open. And once that door is closed, it's forced up against the fuselage and has no way of opening once the aircraft is pressurized. Control of the pressurization or pressurization schedule, as they call it, is all done automatically nowadays. What's the problem with breathing at 30,000 feet? Well, there's simply just not enough oxygen in the air. You can breathe just fine, but you're not getting enough oxygen for your body to work. And so you have a time of useful consciousness before the onset of hypoxia sets in of about 1 minute. And this amount of time varies based on your personal physiology. One of the neat things we get to do in the military is get into the hyperbaric chamber and practice these rapid depressurizations and slow depressurizations and learn about your personal hypoxia symptoms, as each person's hypoxia symptoms, lack of oxygen, is different. We got one of the biggest hyperbaric chambers right here at Beale Air Force Base in Northern California, home of the U-2, the high altitude flyers. And the biggest problem with hypoxia is its insidious onset. You do not realize you are becoming hypoxic. Why? Because the initial symptoms are a sense of euphoria. You can also visually see the symptoms of hypoxia by bluing of the fingernails or bluing of the lips. So this brings us back to the emergency descent checklist. In the case of Southwest 1380, they're again having to deal with this checklist in conjunction with the engine failure checklist. So once you get your oxygen on and communications established, it's time to start heading downhill. The best way to perform an emergency descent is leaving the autopilot on. Why do you want to leave the autopilot on? Because that allows you to set an altitude of 10,000 feet, descend the aircraft, and if in the event any one of the pilots should become incapacitated, the aircraft will recover at 10,000 feet, allowing you to recover yourself. So what do you do with the aircraft with the autopilot on? You set 10,000 feet in the altitude window, hit flight level change. That'll direct the altitude change, the aircraft to change altitude. Go ahead and set the speed. And now initially on a normal emergency descent, you want to get down quickly, so you can crank the speed up to a very high rate of speed. But in this case, and it says in the checklist, if you suspect some kind of structural problem, you might want to back off on that speed. So you got to trade off the amount of time it's going to take you to get down versus the structural integrity of the aircraft. Deploy the speed brakes, the spoilers, the big spoilers you'll see on the top of the wings. That's going to create vibrating and buffeting all the way down, and that's going to help destroy some of the lift so you can get down quickly. And then get a hold of ATC and tell them you're coming down, because there's going to be traffic right below you that you're going to be blowing right through. The easiest way to do that is, if you haven't already done this, the 3 simple words, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. That gets everybody's attention. You give them your call sign, who you are, where you are, what you're doing, and you're heading downhill. And ATC, if you're in a radar environment like the Southwest flight was, starts clearing that aircraft and getting them out of the way. So now you got all your initial emergency action items squared away and you're heading downhill. The pilot flying and the pilot monitoring duties tend to start to separate at this point. The pilot flying is now flying and doing the radio communications with ATC. The pilot monitoring has his hands very full dealing with all the checklists and cleanup items at this point. This leaves very little time to communicate with the passengers in back. Just now getting to step 2, navigate. Where are we going to take this emergency aircraft? This is where the pilot flying comes up with a diversion airport plan, and in this case they decided to divert to Philadelphia. Great decision. That allowed them the time to get the aircraft down, the profile time to get it down, and land in a short amount of time at a familiar airport with enough runway. Step 3, communicate. The crew has already contacted ATC and they've got a plan and they're executing it. they need to get back a hold of the flight attendants in the back of the aircraft and find out what's going on. Typically, they tell the flight attendants the type of emergency, whether they're going to ground evacuate or not, a signal for ground evacuation, and the time that it's going to take them to get to the ground. In this case, the flight attendants may very well have more information on this emergency than the crew up front realizes at this point. In the case of 1380, the flight attendants are going to be the ones that know about the catastrophic nature of this engine failure with the entire inlet section blown off. Why? Because up in front, you cannot see the engines from the cockpit. You cannot even barely see your wing tips unless you really crane around and look hard. So the flight attendants are going to be the ones transmitting this information up to the crew. And as you listen to the AETC audio tapes, you can see why this takes quite a while before the captain realizes that we have part of our aircraft missing. And so it's just beginning to sink into them, into the crew, the pilots, just exactly what has gone on here, including the facts about the injured passengers. So while the captain of Southwest 1380 was flying the aircraft to Philadelphia and talking to ATC, the first officer was busy finishing up a myriad of checklists. The engine failure or fire checklist, perhaps he was doing the engine severe damage separation checklist, the emergency descent checklist with the rapid depressurization, an emergency landing checklist, an emergency landing checklist with suspected structural damage, and finally the normal descent checklist and the normal before landing checklist. Landing with structural damage. On a normal landing, you typically land with full flaps to obtain the slowest possible speed and the shortest landing and rollout distance. When you do a single engine landing, you do with a landing with slightly reduced flap settings, because in the event of a go-around, you want to have the additional performance capability to go around on one engine, and the aircraft is perfectly designed to go around on one engine. It just makes it easier with a reduced flap setting. In this case, engine failure with suspected structural damage, the crew smartly decided to land with only flaps 5, a very low flap setting. Why? Because with the structural damage, we don't know what the stall speed of the aircraft is. We don't know what the landing characteristics of the aircraft are with the suspected structural damage. We have no idea to the extent of the structural damage. So they made a great decision to take a long final, get squared away, and bring it on in with flaps 5 and land at a very high landing speed to bring this emergency to a successful conclusion. And that's why the passengers felt such a rough, hard landing. Now you're safely on the ground, you think the emergency's over, but now the confusion really begins to set in once you get the aircraft stopped and the emergency responders begin responding. What's the plan going to be? Are we going to evacuate this aircraft? No. We got injured passengers. How are we going to get them off the aircraft? And you got to coordinate that with the emergency responders, and they've got the stairs and the capability of getting up to and getting on board the aircraft to help out with your emergency passengers. So I hope this gave you a little better idea of how pilots are trained to deal with these emergencies. We'll have the cockpit voice recorders fairly soon from the NTSB, and we can see exactly how Southwest Flight 1380 dealt with this emergency. And I thought it was a very class act that Captain Tammy Jo Schultz stepped out of the cockpit and greeted every passenger as they stepped off the aircraft. It's only at that point that you as a pilot begin to realize the gravity of the situation that you've just endured. See you here.
Aviate, navigate, no, navigate.
Communicate.
Navigate? Okay. Aviate, navigate, communicate.